All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cosmos Society Online Open House Series. I'm Keith DeStone, and our guest today is Brian Prescott Decie. He is a recently retired full-time teacher of history, Latin, and ancient Greek at the Lebanese American University in Beirut, and he is a very long-time member of Cosmos. So, Brian, we're very happy to have you here today. And let me also unmute you or ask you to unmute so that you can respond here. And you're talking today with us about the topic of Georgios Gemistos Plethon and the role of Byzantine scholarship in the preservation of Platonic and Neo-Platonic thought. So, Brian, thanks for joining us. And as I previewed to you, would you mind telling us at the beginning a bit about what drew you into the study of ancient Greece, or Byzantine, I should say Greece in this case?
Well, thank you very much for hosting me. And I'm very much looking forward to talking about this subject. I've spent quite a lot of time working on it. But as for my connection with the classics, it's really a lifetime thing. I went to very old-fashioned schools. And as a result, I started Latin at the age of 6, Greek at the age of 8, 8.5. And continued them throughout my academic career one way or another. Even when I studied history at university, my special subjects and so on and so forth were almost all of them in the field of Roman and Byzantine history. So it really continued throughout.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very natural progression. That's so early. My high school had Latin, so I began that in what we call the 9th grade, I guess. But you started much earlier, six years old. Amazing.
Yeah, the old-fashioned British prep school, public school system still emphasized classics in my days, and in fact, when I went to public school, my father had a huge fight with the school when he discovered that it was going to be possible for me to entirely skip mathematics and science in favor of classics, history, etc. The result was that I had to do mathematics as well, but there we go.
I see. Okay, well, let's not... Speaking of other kinds of philosophy, I suppose, that's related to your topic of the day. So let's begin with that. Go right ahead.
Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to start with a very trite observation, which is that at 4 o'clock this afternoon, if the Cosmos timetable is correct on the website, there is a study group looking at Plato's Apology. Aha, I thought, serendipity. Only it isn't really, is it? Because in any reasonably large size group of Greek scholars, or philosophers for that matter, there is likely to be a number of people wanting to look at Plato's writings, at Socratic thought, or something of that sort. But ultimately, this is not something that we should really take for granted at all. Because until the 15th century, most of the academic world outside of the Greek world really knew very little indeed about the writings of Plato. Now, the title is a little bit misleading. If you're expecting a full exegesis of Plethon's really very weird philosophy, then you're not going to get it today, because it's been done, and well done, by a Czech, and I'm going to stick my neck out and try and pronounce his name, Wojciech Hladký, I think, in a paper called Plato's Second Coming. I will, at the end of this talk, stick up a list of references and so on, so there's no need to try and give them all now. what I'm going to do instead is look at the way Byzantine scholarship and ultimately Georgios Gemistos Plethon actually carried the torch of Platonic and of Socratic, Platonic and Neo-Platonic thought forward, and how it eventually arrived in the rest of the world. There are a couple of problems. There's a fair amount of literature, but a great deal of the literature treats the issue from a Western perspective. The arrival, if you like, of Platonic thought in the West, rather than the delivery of Platonic thought from Byzantium to the West. This is something that I will look at briefly in a moment or two. The other thing is why it should be that a single man with a single series of lectures should have played such an important role in this transfer. Historians generally nowadays don't much like it when you hold up a single person, a Napoleon or a whatever, and say that this person was especially influential. But Plethon did play a significant role and deserves to be recognized because he gave a great emphasis to a great impetus, to the process in the mid-15th century. By the way, all dates in this lecture, unless otherwise advertised, are AD, not BC, for those of you more used to classical dates. The problem of Byzantium from a Western perspective is a long one. And I can't afford to go into all of it. But what I can do is to point at some of the highlights. One of my students pleased me by showing that she had been reading E.H. Carr's What is History the other day. She trotted out one of Carr's examples. Carr pointed out that as a classicist, when he studied ancient history, the classics were, probably still are, well, then they were, Grote and Mommsen. Grote, the British middle class 19th century historian of Greece, who presents us with Pericles, the Benthamite reformer. Mommsen, the German 1848 Republican, who consequently wrote a history of Rome that never mentioned the empire. And she then followed it up by saying, why do you think Carr doesn't include Gibbon in that list? And of course, she's perfectly right. Carr jumps straight forward from Grote and Mommsen to Trevelyan, Namier, and all sorts of other people who have nothing whatever to do with the ancient or Byzantine world at all. It's as though Gibbon never existed. Gibbon, a product of the Enlightenment, late 18th century, hated the Orthodox Church, very much brought up in Anglican Protestant values, gives us a very negative picture of Byzantium. So intimate, he says, is the connection between the throne and the altar that the banner of the church has very seldom been seen on the side of the people. That's a typical Gibbonism. And there are hundreds such in the Decline and Fall. The very title, Decline and Fall, is negative. And historians over the last half century or century even have been struggling against this negativity because it persists everywhere on the internet, at least. That negativity goes back beyond Gibbon, all the way to Ducange in 1688. He published the Glossarium ad Scriptores Mediae et Infimae Graecitatis. Mediae et Infimae, lower and least worthy Greek. Great. Why should I want to read writers of bad Greek, I wonder? Except, of course, it's not bad Greek, just different Greek. And it continues even today. Edward Said's Orientalism is a great book and very important to historians because it's a serious statement of the problems of colonialism and post-colonialist thought. But in a book that deals with the problems of West and East, Western Orientalists and the Eastern Asiatic or Islamic Orient, he only mentions Byzantium at all 5 times. And 4 of those have to do with English literature. Somehow Byzantium has just disappeared, an irrelevance. The 5th mention of it has to do with Persian wars. Said may be a very valuable statement to post-colonialists, but it does us, as Byzantinists, no service at all. Runciman is also a problem. A recent book by Andrea and Holt quotes him as describing his works as literature, not history. And although they're highly readable, very enjoyable, and Runciman, of course, had a great love for Byzantium, the fact is that they're full of errors. Just on the subject of Plethon, 2 errors pop up in a couple of pages. He talks about large numbers of visitors coming to visit Plethon at Mistras. But in fact, there was only one. And the one visitor from the West was an antiquarian archaeologist, not a philosopher at all. And he came to Mistras because he wanted to visit the ruins of Sparta. Runciman also suggests that Malatesta's tomb, if I can just, let me see, sorry, just a second, there's the right one. Malatesta's tomb, this is the inscription from the tomb, I hope you can see it properly, is a magnificent memorial to Plethon's life. And indeed, it describes Plethon as the best of the Byzantine philosophers and so on and so forth. But Plethon would have hated this. Malatesta, Sigismund Malatesta, stole his body from Mistras, had it dug up and summarily carried away and reburied in the Palazzo Malatesta in Rimini, where Plethon had never been in his life, and then put up a great big inscription in Latin, which Plethon resolutely refused to learn. Plethon gave his lectures not in the 15th century Greek, but in classical Attic Greek, and all his writing is also in classical Greek. I don't think he would have liked that inscription even for a second. He would have hated the thing. And if it hadn't been that he'd already been dug up, he'd have been turning in his grave. The last point I have here is that my school books, for which I have no reference, and I'm quite happy not to have a reference, talk about the way the Franks stole manuscripts from Constantinople starting in 1204 and suggested that what they didn't steal, they must have bought cheap. These Franks, it seems, at the beginning of the 13th century were highly literate, sufficiently discerning to collect the very best manuscripts, and they knew where to sell it to best effect in the West. I don't think. There were, of course, stolen manuscripts. There were, of course, purchased manuscripts. mostly in the 14th and 15th centuries, not in the 13th. But there were also very large numbers of diplomatic gifts, not just to rulers, but gifts between churches, gifts between scholars, exchanges of documents, and it wasn't just one way. There were manuscripts traveling west, of which, of course, the Homeric manuscripts, for instance, in the Marciano library are a good example. But there were manuscripts of Cicero, Aeneid, Caesar, and so on, traveling east at the same time. This is not a one-way handover of knowledge. This is a relationship between the Byzantine and the Western, between scholars on both sides of the fence, if there is even a fence. And we need to rewrite the story to make that much clearer. There's an article by a fellow called Kenneth Seton, which explores this relationship in Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society. Let's not worry, the reference is in the ref list as usual. But it's from a Western perspective. Byzantine scholars, quote, came, unquote, to Florence. They were, quote, invited to Avignon, unquote. He talks about the Greek language in Magna Graecia. Greek civilization was first diminished and then destroyed during the centuries of Roman domination and successive invasions thereafter, he says. But that's rubbish. Scholars of the 13th and 14th century had perfect Greek, studied at Constantinople, traveled to Ferrara, to Avignon, to Padua, and else to Naples and Rome. They moved around as scholars, teachers, ambassadors. It doesn't make sense to look on it just from the perspective of Northern Italy. So much for the problems. Let's see what we can do to put them right. Plato had a bad rap in the West. Aristotle got extensively translated over the years, but very little Plato made it into print, and even less of the Neo-Platonists. There was always somehow an assumption that this could be left in Greek. In 321, I have no idea why that date is always quoted so very precisely. Let's say approximately 321 AD. Chalkidios made a partial translation of the Timaeus, which you can find on Perseus, among other places, and I think in the Latin library. In the 6th century, Boethius translated and paraphrased, summarized a good deal of Aristotle. These include translations of the De Interpretatione, the categories, and so on. He does offer us some Neoplatonic ideas, mostly from Porphyry, and a little from Iamblichus even. The question of universals is very much a Neoplatonic idea. And the Consolatio does have some Socratic content. But it's well hidden away, tucked away underneath the Aristotelian material. And you have to remember that Boethius, above all others, became the standard schoolboy text of the Middle Ages in the West, and continued so until the 15th century at any rate, maybe the 16th in many places. In Spain, we have Alfarabius, the great Arab. Notice that his name, spelt by his contemporaries and by himself, is always spelt with a PH. He was a scholar of Greek, even though all his work, as it survives, is available to us in Latin and Arabic. He does include a fair amount of Porphyry from the Neoplatonics. little bits of Socrates, and nothing much directly from Plato. Avicenna in the 10th century is so completely Aristotelian that it comes as a real surprise when you come across a single section discussing the Neo-Platonic concept of the emanations, which actually got him into a good deal of trouble. By the 10th century, Plato is no longer on the curriculum in any form, nor is Socrates, nor are the Neoplatonists in the Western world. They are not quite unknown, but certainly not studied. They're considered unacceptable because Socratic thought and Christian thought do not mesh very well, and Socratic and Islamic thought even worse, and therefore are not promoted. On the other hand, things are very, very different in Constantinople. And when I found this poem, I loved it so much that I put it in your handout, and, well, I'm going to read it to you. Hypertinas vulio ton allotrion tis sis apilis exceleste Christemo, Platona ke Plutarchon exceliomi. Amphorari sic eloron, caton tropon tis sis nomis engista prospevicotes. Ide ignoesan os theos siton olon, entaphtha tis sis Christotitos thimonon, vina pandastorean sosin telis. And a nice translation by Hussey. If, my Christ, thou shouldst wish to exempt any of the pagans from thy threats, choose for me Plato and Plutarch. Both these, in thought and deed, showed how very near they were to thy laws. They may not have known that thou art the God of all, but this is only a further claim on thy mercy, the gift through which thou desirest to save all men. Lovely stuff. Basically, the author Ioannis Mavropoulos, in the early 11th century, he was the teacher of Michael Psellos, is working hard here to reconcile Christianity to Socratic and Platonic thought. A lovely thing. The West in the 11th century continues to shift away. 1088 sees the first university, the so-called Alma Mater Studiorum at Bologna. At least that's the date they always put on their website. Independent universities spring up, and they are slowly breaking free of the church. See Helen Waddell, The Wandering Scholars, for detail. But they don't break free of the Aristotelian tradition. They stay almost wholly Aristotelian in their thought processes. In the 11th and 12th centuries, spanning the 11th and 12th centuries, a movement develops in Sicily. As I'm sure you're aware, the Normans are in charge. They are educated, they speak Arabic and Greek, not just Norman French and Latin. They employ people from the Arab world and from the Greek world. I'll give just a couple of examples, because if I started cataloging all the various scholars in Sicily, you would die of boredom, I'm quite sure. But George of Antioch is a very big name. Notice that he comes from Antioch, from the far east of the Byzantine world, or by the 11th century, more like the far west of the Arab world, frankly. He's a diplomat, a politician, a polymath, polyglot, and a scholar. And he brought others with him. One of the men he brought into Sicily was a man called Henricus Aristippus. He translated two works of Plato's, the Meno and the Phaedo, both of which, however, have got lost. He also did a translation of Ptolemy's Almagest and commentaries on various other works, including Thucydides. This is where we can answer Seton's complaint about Greek in Magna Graecia. Maybe Greek did not wholly survive from the classical era through to the 14th century, but Greek was certainly doing very, very well indeed under the Normans, first in Sicily and later in Naples. By the middle of the 12th century, and there is no reason whatever to think that the scholarship that went on in the monasteries of Calabria, Sicily, Naples was in any way inferior to that of Constantinople or Trebizond or other cities. In fact, we can be pretty sure it was up to standard because scholars from these regions frequently visited Constantinople. Continuing through the 12th century, we inevitably come to Eustathios, Bishop Thessaloniki. He wrote commentaries on Homer, Thucydides. The commentary on Homer is still included in most texts. It's that good, line-by-line commentary, very detailed. And it's in Thessaloniki that we start to be able to identify a clear educational canon in the East. The standard texts for epic poetry, Homer. For history and rhetoric, because Thucydides was considered a rhetor as well as an historian, Thucydides. For philosophy, Aristotle and Plato, together with Euclid and Archimedes for the advanced students in the quadrivium. At the same time, we can look back to Bologna, Padua, and one or two other universities which are now running, Verona, for instance, to find a similar Western canon. Instead of Homer, you get Aeneid. Instead of Thucydides, you get Caesar. Instead of Aristotle, you get Aristotle, of course. But Plato is missing, and Cicero takes his place. Western sources in the following century or so tend to reflect this. Gerard de Cremona, for instance, in, where was it, Toledo, I think he worked, that's right, is a translator from Arabic, not from Greek. He translates big chunks of Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, bits of the Almagest, not all of it, but they're very poor translations. And I think I gave you Bacon's comment on the importance of quality in translation. Longe error major accidit. Yeah, right. A far greater error occurs in translated philosophy unless the translator understands the body of knowledge, not just the languages. Many of the translators, including Gerard de Cremona, are weak in all three areas, and this creates problems. On the other hand, in Constantinople, by the 13th century, there is no such problem. Everybody speaks Greek. Everybody speaks Latin. It's standard. And there is no great difficulty with languages. The beginning of the 13th century shows us massive problems, obviously, with the Frankish invasion. The filioque in the creed is becoming an issue as well. It's not actually an east-west division at all. Parts of the West are pro-filioque, other parts are anti-filioque. And the same is true in the Orthodox world. So it's not a simple East-West division at all. But in the Greek world, the pro-filioque tend to be also anti-scholarship, or tend to take a different view of scholarship. There's George Akropolitis, an incredible career. He started as a grand logothetes. He went on to become a professor at the Maraura University, that's the University of Constantinople, then emperor, and finished his career as a monk with the lovely name of Jehoshaphat. He was a diplomat. He spent time in Lyon, in Italy, and so on. And he was pro-filioque because he was working very, very hard to secure the interest of the West, both to free Byzantium from Frankish rule and to obtain help against the Turks. George of Cyprus was, I think, his pupil. Yes, he was. Very worried with the filioque. Again, he wants the filioque because he wants Western support against Turkish power. And it is striking that during this period, quite a lot of Byzantine scholars migrated to Cyprus until it was possible to return to Constantinople. Another pupil, Maximus Planoudis, became ambassador to Venice, a very important post for obvious political reasons. He wrote commentaries in Greek on Hermogenes and Theocritus. Neo-Platonic ideas are floating up there. He wrote a verse version of Aesop. Georgia, you will love that, in Greek. And yes, he must have been familiar with Phaedrus because he borrows quite a few of the stories in exactly the same form. He presents Socratic ideas throughout his writings. He translated Caesar, bits of Ovid, bits of Cicero, the whole of Boethius' Consolatio, with the verse bits in beautiful classical verse, and a good chunk of Augustine's sermons and City of God from the Latin into the Greek. This is a two-way street. This is the Byzantine world picking up on the Western educational canon. They are making sure that they have the same academic background, Aeneid, Caesar, Aristotle, Cicero, and so on, that their partners in the Western scholarly world have. In the 14th century, sorry, I'm watching the clock, we see Calabrians, Barlaam and Leontius Pilatus, traveling to Avignon and Florence. Both of them had worked at Constantinople. Both of them had connections in Naples. Barlaam became a teacher to Petrarch for a little while. Leontius Pilatus turned out to be a really bad teacher with a pupil called Boccaccio. The connections are getting closer and closer here. Petrarch, as you may have seen if you read the texts or had a look at them at any rate, had a copy of what he thought was the complete works of Plato in Greek. He couldn't read the thing, and it actually turned out to be only about 50% of the complete works, with several spurious works tacked on at the back. But he gets into a fight with Boccaccio and with other scholars. He won't let go of the thing. They can only come and read it in his house if he wants. And since he was not living in the same city, he was first in Avignon and then in Milan, nobody ever gets to read the thing. Though nowadays you can go to the Sorbonne Library and it's sitting there in the manuscript collection. The very end of the 14th century sees the beginnings of a sort of takeoff. In Florence, the Byzantine Empire sends a man called Chrysoloras, Manuel Chrysoloras, to the West as a diplomat. His job, as usual, is to drum up cash and, if possible, military support for the increasingly beleaguered Byzantine Empire. Like diplomats all the way back to Georgios, he wasn't paid for his diplomatic duties, so he had to find a job. He found a job, courtesy of the Medici family, opening a Greek language school, and he turned out to be a truly gifted teacher. There's a fine collection of his pupils who all basically clearly loved the man, idolized him. What's important about this is that maybe a dozen people in the West, non-Greeks, come out of this school with enough Greek to start to read some of the manuscripts that have been piling up in the libraries of Florence, Venice, Padua, and so on. There's an excellent life of Chrysoloras by a man called Ian Thompson in the reference lists, if you want it. As a result of this, a few of these scholars become significant in the university world of northern Italy. A man called Leonardo Bruni has enough Greek to start to translate a little bit of Plato and to do his own translations of Aristotle. He doesn't like Plato. One of the first passages he comes across is the horrible one about Socrates' views on women. And that one really puts him off. But nevertheless, a new version of the Timaeus comes out in a manuscript form, and a couple of other things. This is a big change for the studium in Florence. In the 14th century, they were teaching rhetoric, public speaking. But in the 15th century, they begin to teach metaphysics. It may not sound like much, but it's a platform on which Platonic thought can build in a way that it could not from the schools of rhetoric. Venice and Padua equally changed from Averroist Aristotelian schools to publishing Byzantine commentaries on the Iliad, on Thucydides, and so on. And printing comes early, especially in Padua, with the result that a few of these start to come out in printed editions. The school in Rome starts to concentrate on more reliable textual material. In the early 15th century, they start to a new edition of the New Testament, which eventually produces the Vulgate. It is based on the Greek Kini, on the Greek text, not on translations from Hebrew and so on. In the meantime, the Filioque War is getting worse. Back in Constantinople, there is a sharp division. There's a man called Kavasilas, Nikolaos Kavasilas, who comes up with the term Hellenismos, Hellenism. Yeah, that's actually a 15th century term rather than an ancient term. Hellenists, according to Kavasilas, are those who study the Attic Greek texts and other ancient Greek texts, including the Iliad and so on. Anti-Hellenists are those who want to avoid these things. The anti-Hellenists are also anti-Filioque on the whole. So there's been a switch here. The Hellenists are actually more likely to connect with the Western world than the anti-Hellenists. The anti-Hellenists are also hesychasts, which means that they Well, the best way is to quote Matthew chapter 6, verse 6. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, pray to your Father who is unseen. Do not keep on babbling like pagans. People who talk too much, who pray too publicly, babble like pagans. Hesychasts do it quietly in private and don't study the ancient pagan texts. On the whole, the anti-classicists win. George Trapezundius, who obviously comes from Trebizond, a Greek and Latin polymath, bilingual, Ambrosius, a philosopher at Ferrara, together with Plethon. Finally, we got to the man. Bessarion, Plethon's pupil, and so on. Many of these men, Ambrosius especially, continue to work for the Turkish Sultan Mehmet after the fall of Constantinople and Trebizond. Just because the world has changed rulers doesn't mean that the schools will close. They continue, which rather puts paid to the idea of 1453 being a benchmark for all the scholars of Constantinople to rush off to Italy for safety. I don't think it was like that. Plethon, perhaps the most extreme of all the pro-Hellenists. He was forced out of Constantinople by the hesychast Gregory Palamas, who attempted to have him tried as a heretic. He moved to Mistras, where he was protected by the emperor. Mistras, in case you don't know it, is the last capital of Byzantium in the west, near Sparta, a tiny little village with a beautiful miniature Hagia Sophia, right down to the same patterns on the floor, marking where the emperor and empress and the patriarch should stand during services. But everything in miniature. It's scarcely more than a village. Plethon was not quite a pagan. His philosophical work would suggest to you that he was more of a Neo-Platonist and more like Iamblichus rather than Plotinus, not the Enneads, but the much more mystic work of Iamblichus than anything else. But just like Mavropous centuries before, Plethon was working hard to make Socratic thought acceptable in Christian exegesis. And throughout his works, you will find that there is a continuous strand of careful connections with Christian thought. The works include On the Differences, De Differentiis, that's the differences between Plato and Aristotle, and a work on the laws. There are others. He was ambassador to Florence and Ferrara in the Great Council of Basel, Florence and Ferrara, which began in 1431 and finished after moving twice to avoid the plague in 1445. There were several other scholars at Mistras, most of them involved in Hellenistic work, copying Plutarch, Thucydides, translating and commenting. They had a nice little university going and protection from the emperor to help. This is where you get a picture, I think. Ah, yes. How do I get a picture? That's right. Click there, share. This is the official photograph, if you like, of the Council of Ferrara. Well, actually, it's the procession of the Magi in the chapel of the Medici, the private chapel of the Medici. And it was painted not at the time of the conference, but 15 years later. It is full of strange connections, at least strange to us. The three kings are present. On the left is Caspar. There he is, wearing cloth of gold on a white horse. And he is, in fact, Lorenzo de' Medici, who can't have been at the conference because he was only 11 years old when it finished, but who was the Medici who paid for the painting in the chapel, of course. Balthasar in the middle. Sorry, no, Balthasar on the right, that's better, is almost certainly John VIII, the Byzantine emperor, John VIII Palaeologos. And that's fairly identifiable because we have several other paintings of him. In the middle, Melchior is representing either the Emperor Sigismund or Joseph, the Patriarch of Constantinople. Opinions vary. They both died during the conference. So that's a bit odd as well. Many people show up twice, including some who were never there. The artist has put himself in, Benozzo Gozzoli. Benozzo may or may not have been there. We will never be quite sure, but here he is in amongst the Eastern delegation, or part of the Eastern delegation, which is actually up on the, about halfway up on the left-hand side of the picture. Immediately to the right of Benozzo Gozzoli is Plethon himself with the remarkable black and gold hat and the beautifully permed beard. Behind him, looking rather grouchy, is probably Leonardo Bruni, the early translator of Plato. Everybody in this group is one of the pro-Hellenists, if you like. Connected to this group is a concept which is a pretty standard Byzantine trope. Renaissance trope, I mean. The hunt in a great curve over the head of Lorenzo de' Medici. This is not the hunt of the Uccello in the Ashmolean Museum. It's a rather politer affair and not so sexually explicit, as it were. But what are they hunting? Is it Platonic love? Is it amor studii? Or is it something a bit earthier? Given the connection with the people in this left-hand crowd, we would certainly expect something a bit more philosophical there. There we are, stop the share on that, don't need it. Plethon at Florence. By the way, his name is Georgios Gemistos, and Plethon, of course, is Attic Greek for Gemistos. Gemistos is the modern Greek form of the 15th and still is. It's the word we used for stuffed tomatoes. Plethon used to write and lecture in Attic Greek. Quite a lot has been made of this by some scholars, but that's basically silly. All the scholars of the Orthodox Church used Attic Greek as their basic vehicle, their main language. Plethon did it rather better. His Attic Greek is really rather good, which is not so true of some of the other scholars. He was invited to lecture at the conference of Ferrara. This is, again, not very special. Conferences of this sort were mostly to resolve theological issues, but they were also for diplomatic purposes, but scholars would use them as opportunities to exchange information. Plethon gave a series of lectures, and it seems that his name had been heard of in the West because Cosimo de' Medici showed up in person for this lecture, as did a group of scholars. Leonardo Bruni, whom I've mentioned a couple of times, Sigismund Malatesta, the soldier who eventually stole Plethon's body, who was also a fairly decent scholar, a very important young man called Marsilio Ficino, whom we'll talk about later, Pico de Mirandola, who wrote the Oration on the Dignity of Man later in his life, Gentile de' Becchi, the political advisor to Cosimo and his financial advisor above all, and Giovanni Cavalcanti, who invented the term Platonic love. Quite an interesting little group of people, and most of them probably had enough Greek to at least halfway understand the lecture or lectures. We don't know how many lectures there were. What's important here is that it wasn't a book. It wasn't a manuscript. It wasn't something that they had to sit down and struggle with to try and get meaning out of. This was a man standing up, talking about Socrates. It was a piece of the dialogue in ancient terms. And like any piece of the dialogue, it enabled them to step forward and discuss it amongst themselves after Plethon had moved on. I cannot emphasize too much the difference in this case between the spoken transmission of first Chrysoloras and then Plethon and the transmission that took place in manuscripts. It's the spoken form that makes it possible for these scholars to start working effectively. Marsilio Ficino managed to persuade, with the help of Gentile de' Becchi, managed to persuade Cosimo de' Medici to give them a villa, which they called the Platonic Academy. We don't know if there was anything formal about it, and we don't think Cosimo de' Medici ever paid anything other than the upkeep of the villa. It was simply a place for a group of friends to meet. But it was enough. It was a place where they could sit down and start talking about, well, Platonic ideas. Interestingly, within a couple of years, the Paduans, possibly in fright, had opened up something they called the Aristotelian Academy, which didn't actually last very long. Lost my place. That's better. Oops. The other thing about Plethon, apart from this extraordinary set of lectures, is that he brought with him a small group of pupils. Most of them came to Ferrara as his assistants. Some of them arrived after he had left Italy as refugees from the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. 3 or 4 are very important. Bessarion, who came from Trebizond, became a cardinal after Ferrara. He joined the Roman Church and became a cardinal, and was able through Rome to influence many translations. Ioannis Argyropoulos became a teacher of Greek at the Studium in Florence. One of his pupils was Lorenzo de' Medici, another was Johann Reuchlin, from whom we get a connection to Luther and Maximilian. Demetrios Chalkokondylis was a leader at the Studium, also a teacher of Greek. He also spent time in Padua and in Rome, and worked on the first printed edition of Homer. Erasmus was living in a room above the printer's shop when that Homeric edition was in production, in early production. Now there's a heck of a thought, isn't it? The connections start to build very fast indeed through this small group of Greeks who have moved into the Italian world. The academy itself remains the major center. Between 1450 odd and 1484, they published most of Plato in Latin translation, some of it horrible, some of it quite good. They published a copy of Diogenes Laertios, the Lives of the Philosophers. They published Plotinus Enneads. They published bits of Porphyry, bits of Plotinus. Why did I say Plotinus again? Bits of the Hermetica, that's better, and so on. A long list of publications, and most of these make it into print, not just manuscript. Between 1423 and 1603, Hankins tells us he wrote the two-volume work, Plato in the Italian Renaissance, absolutely massive tomes. Between 1423 and 1603, more than 100 editions of Plato were published, mostly in France and in Switzerland. That's really takes off in a very small way before Plethon, but after Plethon with increasing speed. If you don't want to read the whole of Hankins to get the hang of how Platonic thought expanded during the Italian Renaissance, a lady called Jane Sears has written a book called Plato in Renaissance England, which very kindly summarizes it in about 2 chapters. Ultimately then, I've run over time, haven't I? No Byzantine scholarship, no Socrates, no Plato, no Neo-Platonism. Second, Byzantine scholarship always had very strong Western connections, and we should recognize that this is a two-way force. It is an exchange of ideas, not just a passage of Plato to the West. And third, without the final impetus of Plethon, the lecturer who stood up and made it accessible to a small group of people who were in a position to do something about it, it might have taken a lot longer before Plato really made it into the syllabi of the Western world. That is more than enough. I'm at least 20 minutes over time, for which I apologize, Keith. And I think I should hand it over to you. I'll mute and unmute as needed.
Okay, perfect. No, that was very enlightening. But I think there are a few questions. So I'll jump right into that. And let me also change the view here to the more conversational gallery view. So yeah, there's a question at least on the YouTube chat, but here in our call, we have Georgia with something to say. Go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's like you brought Georgios Gemistos to Cosmos Society, so thank you very much.
I hope so.
I would like to say and ask you to say the following and ask you then, because obviously it is let's say common knowledge that Plato and Aristotle is, and certainly more Plato, but they were taboo for this era for the obvious reasons, because they couldn't let's say accept the philosophy, because certainly Platonic philosophy was not a secular one. You cannot, it had this metaphysical dimension and very concrete parameters which the Christians would never accept. So I think this emphasizes, or let's say underlines, the importance of his, let's say, radical thought and radical, let's say, teaching, because it was a moment in history where nobody wanted to hear about reincarnation, about transmigration of souls, and these kind of things. So when the new academy, was reestablished, the Platonic Academy you mentioned by Medici, there was a kind of a historical moment, because till then it was not allowed, such a thing was not kind of allowed to exist. You mentioned, you said so many things about his life. You mentioned those nomoi, which they were partially burned by scholarios. And so the passages he didn't burn, he only didn't burn for his, let's say, justification to show why he had reasons to burn them. I would like to ask you your opinion about the following. How much do you think weighed in his mind the fact that at his time, the empire was coming to a very close end? And his philosophy must have come, I wonder, was it coming as his, let's say, reforming answer to what was about to happen? That was his, let's say, answer to the problem, how to restore the empire by following this pagan, let's say, this Spartan polytheistic concept.
I wonder. I don't think we can really get right inside his head in quite that way. We don't know exactly when he died, 1450 or 1452. We don't know whether he lived to see the actual fall of Constantinople or not. There are different opinions. But he knew it was coming. They all did. He knew, even at Ferrara, that they had failed, that they had not got the money they needed, they had not got the troops they needed, and that ultimately they would not be able to fight off the Turks. So from a purely political point of view, the embassy was a complete failure. However, I don't think Plethon saw it like that at all. I think that Plethon and men like him, the Hellenistes, the pro-Hellenes, saw it as a means of achieving survival for their culture. What you have to remember is that the Greek attitude to Socratic and Platonic thought was never quite the same as the Western attitude. You are, of course, quite right to say that Platonic thought in the West was anathema. After all, Socrates tells you to ask questions, awkward questions about the universe and God and so on. But the Christian Bible, the Islamic Quran, tell you firmly that God will supply the answers. It's all handed down. There is no need to ask those questions at all. In fact, it's improper to ask the questions. Blasphemous. But that had not been the case in Constantinople especially. There was always a school of thought, like that poet, Mavropoulos, which felt that there is a place to question the nature of the universe, and that it doesn't matter if not all of Socrates' answers are correct, or Aristotle's for that matter. Butterflies on strings, really? And that very often it's the questions rather than the answers that actually matter, because in the view of a man like Plethon, these are questions which can be used to bring you nearer to God. If you read Hladky, you will find quite a lot of information on the way he makes that work, technically speaking, as a philosopher. At the same time, Plethon was, let's face it, about one bar short of barking mad. he got up in front of, 100 Italians in the palace and gave a lecture in Attic Greek with 5 people in the room who could maybe understand half of it. He presented himself as believing in the ancient gods in parallel and alongside Christ and the Christian congregation. He presented Neo-Platonic ideas, mostly from Iamblichus, some from Porphyry, that really will stretch your mind just to work out how he tries to make them work at all, let alone in Christian terms. It's no surprise at all that people like Palamas and Scholarius wanted to get rid of this man. They wanted him in jail. They wanted his books burnt, especially the Nomi, but the De Differentiis as well. But he had the protection of the emperor, and he had, at least putatively, some sort of protection in the West. He had a safety valve. He could stay in Mistras and nobody could touch him. And nobody could touch him in Italy either, because even if Leonardo Bruni did get himself in trouble, which he did, partly over the Platonic publications, people like Ficino, Mirandola, and so on, were there, and they were sufficiently powerful that they could protect the Greek scholars who were providing them with this new source of information.
I hate to interrupt that thought, but I want to leave time for another question or two.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, Maria, go ahead.
Just a quick one. Brian, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I just thank you also for mentioning George Trabzon, this formidable child.
Trabzonius, yes.
Yes, who by the way is my favorite. You know that there is a Greek book, a PhD thesis turned into a monograph by Alkis Angelou. He used to be a professor of modern Greek literature, and he wrote his PhD. It is called Platonos Teuchai. It's an old book. I can send you via email the title, and it examines and it discusses exactly this topic. My question is, you mentioned only briefly the Ottomans, and I just a food for thought. Could you please inform us about, the Ottomans were quite, as you rightly said, some schools continued. They didn't cease to exist. So could you please tell us only briefly shed some light on this rather ambiguous and not so much discussed relation between Ottomans and these remnants of Byzantine literati who stayed in Constantinople, or they had to leave somehow later? So thank you very much.
I am no great expert. I know that there was a school of scholarship that continued in Constantinople and in Trapezus for some time. Over time, it became increasingly enclosed and monastic, as you might expect. But it was for a while a perfectly viable alternative. There was no reason why the scholars of the period of the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, or fragmentations, better word, Trebizond, Mistras, and so forth, there was no reason for those people to have to move west. The world did become a more violent place, and that wasn't entirely the fault of Ottomans. Exactly. In fact, to a significant extent, it was actually the fault of Westerners. Note that when Malatesta, Sigismundus, picked up Plethon's body and dragged it off back to Rimini. The reason he was at Mistras was not because he had come to get the body, but because he was there on a military campaign.
Exactly.
The fragmentation brought its own political problems as well. No particular surprises there. Look at Lebanon and Syria right now. And as this happened, there was less and less safety. So scholars did tend to move into exile. People like Bessarion went to Rome because it was a better choice. They would have a better life, quite frankly, and there were more options to teach to better universities and so on. Some chose to stay. Those who chose to stay continued the traditions almost unchanged as far as I know.
Yeah.
The same old arguments. It's as though they tried to stop the clock.
Yes.
There was money. Mehmet was not called the Magnificent for no reason at all. But very quickly, you see a failure of innovation. There are no new ideas coming out. And for a university, okay, we like to be very conservative in our universities, but when there are no new ideas, that's ultimately death. And essentially, that's what happened, of course. But I do not know the full detail, I'm sorry.
One last question, not too dissimilar.
And yes, I would love to have a copy of that thesis, by the way. Yes.
Yes,
sorry.
I will send it either to Keith and or he can send me the. Sorry, I have to leave. I apologize. Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. I hope we have more on the same topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then one last question. This one is from someone watching on YouTube. How is it that knowledge of Platonic thought didn't really arrive in Russia, despite the fact that it was under influence so strongly by Byzantium? Any thoughts on that?
No, I don't actually. That's a very good question. After all, though I haven't actually mentioned them in this talk, there are some strong connections between Plethon himself and a couple of the other scholars around him with Russia. So why did they never pick it up? For that matter, Aristotle doesn't make a great deal of ground in Russia. Is it perhaps that the Russians are more interested in other things, not so interested in the philosophical background? I have no idea. I will have to investigate is the answer. Try and find out. It's a very good question, however.
Fair enough. All right,
Yeah.
well, I think that we should wrap things up here. So I just want
Yes,
to
I
thank
am
you.
looking for the chat just for a second.
Sure.
There it is. Sorry, because I just want to attach everyone. There we go.
All right, and we
Let's
can
hope the
add
thing-
that also to the recording afterwards.
Okay, I think you'll have to, because I seem to be having trouble sending up the references. It's not taking my file for some strange reason.
Okay,
Just
just
by
send
the
that along
by-
to me, and I'll forward it.
I will, yes.
Brian, I did
it-
receive the address. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. A pleasure.
Great
Thanks,
lecture.
everyone.
Really exciting. Really
See you
good.
all next
Thank
time.
you very much, everybody. Okay.